fully, but he can introduce himself, and he'll be our next speaker.
Good evening. My name is Chad Kilby. I'm the safety specialist for PPL Electric Utilities. My coverage area is from Scranton, Honesdale, down to the Lehigh Valley in this area. As you guys know, we recently had Mayes was fully affected, as well as a lot of other towns in the southern region who were just affected by large power outages. This summer we've been plagued by multiple power outages, large power outages throughout our system. This past year, typically we average one of these large power outages every 3 years. This particular year, with the way the weather's been, we've averaged 4 in just these past couple summer months. So the severity of the weather coming through our region has been quite severe. We've been doing a lot of presentations for, I'm the safety manager, been doing a lot of presentations for PennDOT workers as well as local road crews on how to react to these emergencies. As you know, when power lines come down, there is potential for these lines to be energized in numerous different ways. So tonight's presentation is going to be a little bit of awareness to you guys on what to do around our power lines if they do come down. A lot of people understand power, they flip the switch on and they flip it off, and they don't realize the backbone to our system and how we have to restore it. To protect our workers, we have to follow the OSHA regulations. Anybody familiar with lockout, tagout?
Yes.
And we have to follow that same system, but in a larger fashion on our lines. So everything we do has to be in a controlled manner so that when our employees are working on these lines, we don't end up with anybody getting shot. Ultimately, our goal with our employees is that all of our workers go home the same way they came. And it's a hazardous business. It's a high-risk job when you're working with electricity. But the other factor is when we have trees on these lines, you've seen them where the lines are bowed a bit, there's a lot of tension and pressure that's behind these trees. So we have to use a tree caution when we're trying to get those lines, the trees off those lines. So tonight's presentation is going to be a little bit of awareness to you guys about what to do when our lines are down on the ground, or if there is an issue with trees on the lines in the area. Originally, when EMA contacted me, they said it was going to be geared towards more of the fire department. I'll gear it towards the citizens here the best I can with this presentation. Potential dangers. What potential dangers do we have? We have, our system normally feeds one direction to your house. When we have power outages and power goes up to your house, there we go, we flip the switch. Now you put generators in play. Now our power is typically fed in one direction. Now we have an additional hazard we have to watch out for coming from the other direction due to the potential of backfeeding our system. Very good. Because everybody knows that little can that's out on the pole, right? Well, that comes down, that's the high voltage, it steps it down to your residential power. Well, if people backfeed that system, it takes it from your residential power level back up to the high voltage, 7.2 thousand volts, 7.2 kV. When you see our three-phase running down the road, it's actually 12 kV. Now, if you think about 12,000 volts and then 7.2, take 7.2 times 3, it doesn't quite equal 12, right? It's for the engineers to figure out logarithmic functions that they do, but it comes out to 12,000 volts.
Whoever is great.
There we go. I don't like displaying that too. Biggest thing with our power lines is respect them. A lot of times we run into areas where the police department goes, hey, we need you guys a favor. Maybe one of our lines came down or a residential feed came down across the roadway. Just because it's not on the roadway jumping around and arcing and sparking, you know, like where you can tell it's obviously live. They feel that just because it's not doing that, they can come along and pull it up and pull it to the side of the road. Very dangerous, very risky, and any individual that does that is lucky. There is what we call tree guarding on our wires these days. In areas where we have the potential for trees coming down our lines, the newer lines we're installing, it's what we call XLP. It's a coating that's on the outside of the wire in the middle here that protects, if the tree limb or something were to come down and touch it, it doesn't trip the line out. But by no means is that insulation. If it were to wear, you get a little hole in it, it doesn't take much for it to track out through like a little pinhole. So by no means is a wire like this insulated. This is just tree guard, and but it can lay on the ground, and once it burns back to the plastic coating, it could still be energized. So it's a risk that is out there. Now, through public awareness, to stay away, distance to stay away from our lines is 10 feet minimum. For the normal lines that are running down your street here, 10 feet minimum. Now, has anybody ever seen anybody trim a tree off of, or I talk last to the road crews, but they ask them if they trim trees off of bell wires. Do they take any precautions?
What's a bell wire?
A bell wire, good question, appreciate it. Bell wire is your telephone lines. We refer to bell telephone, bell lines. They have a typically a steel messenger, and they're copper as well, or a conductor of metal. So, if a tree were to come down and put sag onto our line, and it were to push those lines down into the telephone lines, do those telephone lines have the potential to become energized?
Yes.
Absolutely. So you have to be very cautious whenever these crews are out in the area cutting these trees. They have to take precautions to make sure that there are not trees on our power lines that are pushing them down and making contact with the bell lines. It's just an additional hazard that's out there while we're doing storm restoration. On this past storm restoration, we had over 1,200 guys that I onboarded just in the Lehigh Valley here. As the crews finished up in Harrisburg and everything, we had additional couple hundred crews coming up this way. They gave us a hand towards the end of the storm. So we were hit from Harrisburg, Lancaster, up into this area. Now typically you guys know the northeast up in the Pocono area, that's usually the area that gets clogged. Recently, last year we had ice storm down in this area as well. And this Emmaus and up on the hill was real bad with the ice storm we had. So the biggest thing is keeping 10-foot distance away from our lines. Now the basics of electricity wants to find the quickest and easiest path to ground. Electricity doesn't care who you are, what you do, what your career is, or how comfortable you are relying on electricity. Anybody comfortable working with electricity and electricians in here? All right. I get one or two people that say they're comfortable working with electricity. All of our employees, we stress to them, do not be comfortable working with electricity. It's a hazardous, unknown, that could, if you're not being careful working around it, could be extremely hazardous to you. Now we do have protective equipment that we wear with our rubber gloves. I'll pass these around. These are what our guys wear when they're working on energized lines, as well as they wear rubber sleeves. That's so that we can work the lines live. In the past storm, we had so much damage on the lines, we worked all the lines de-energized. But you might be asking, all right, we had breaks in our lines, we had lines down on the ground. How do we consider them de-energized? What we do is we take the ground from the top line, the primary line, and we ground it to our neutral line. Our neutral lines are periodically on different poles, lead to different grounds. So that takes and eliminates a lot of the potential to work on those lines. Do our guys still use extreme caution when they're working on those lines? Absolutely. But when we ground on both, say we're working on this in this area of the ladder, we'll ground on both sides of it to be able to make sure that we have no potential from our source side, which is our side we feed in from our substations, as well as the side we feed in, which is the side coming from the residents for potential backfeed. So we make sure there's barriers in place to be able to protect ourselves. So, as I said, I want to find the quickest and easiest path. So, if electricity was traveling through this excavator and was going to the ground, and you came along and provided a parallel path and touched this line as well as the ground, is that electricity just going to travel through yours or going to travel through the excavator? The loader? Both. It's going to travel through both. So, electricity doesn't care which path. It's going to travel first off the path with least resistance, but secondly, it's going to travel through its other alternate source. So electricity just wants to find the quickest and easiest path to ground. Different objects that can do that is your body. Your body is mainly made up of water, tree branches, as well as metal objects. We talked about the bell wires. Even low voltage can be dangerous. It's not the voltage that would be the part that would be fatal. it's the amps. And it only takes what we call milliamps, real low amperage, that could put the heart into defibrillation and cause a fatality. And that is why we take so much caution when we're putting the lines up, as well as to try to educate the public as much as possible to stay away from the lines. Now when you're dealing with high voltage, even your residential power, when you're dealing with that, an amp or milliamp can be dangerous, so you got to use extreme caution. They do sell a lot of equipment out there now to be able to test residential power sources to see if it's energized or de-energized. But whenever you're working with electricity, you want to make sure you test it. All of our guys practice what we call test before touch. So even though we grounded it now, before we go and touch that line, we'll use tested equipment that protects us from touching those lines to be able to ensure that that line is assured de-energized. Electric shock and burns. Unfortunately, with electricity, it's usually not very kind to the individuals. Anybody ever have a pig roast? Well, that's the best way I can explain kind of what happens when we get electrocuted. So, it doesn't take much, but it turns the body, and you might not see anything on the outside, but it's actually burning the insides, electricity. So, just because you look decent on the inside doesn't mean you might not have an electrical burn inside of your body. Now, if you're providing a path to ground, if you make contact with your arm and you're providing a path to ground with your hand, it would travel across the body and down. And if it went across the heart, that's not a good situation. A lot of times when people do make contact, it'll travel down their arm and down their legs, down through the legs. Those individuals have a higher chance of surviving, but it's still very dangerous. And the outcome is not usually very positive. This is a picture, it's relatively old, but it gets the meaning across. Our foreman had come across a job up in the Susquehanna area, north, in our northern part, and the tree came down across the lines, and there's a guardrail running along that roadway. What's cut off in the photo was some road crew workers. Guess where they were sitting? On the guardrail. Were they lucky that day? Yes. Absolutely. Fortunately, there was not much moisture in that tree, and it did not the electricity did not track down through that tree to the guardrail. Otherwise, we could have had a really bad situation. The individuals, when they got off the line, first thing they said is we didn't know. So, when you're around electricity or see damage to the lines, the first thing you want to do is take a step back. Look at your big picture of what's around you. If you're in a situation where you're going down the road and trees might be coming down in front of you or back of you. There's a couple people that had their cars stranded in this past storm because a tree might have fallen in front of them and the trees fell behind these individuals. So now their car is in between these trees and they couldn't get out of that situation. As you know, when the trees started to fall this past storm with all the snow weight on them, they started to fall quick and you didn't know where they were coming down. A lot of times if our crews are in the woods working on lines and it starts to get to that situation where these trees are just coming down or the winds in the ice storm picked up a little bit and it's dark out, we can't see where those tree branches are snapping at. We have to get our guys out of that location to a safe location because it doesn't do our guys any good if they get clobbered by a good branch and end up on the ground. So there's a lot of precautions that we run when we're getting these lines back up based on the situation and the weather conditions at the time. This past storm was perfect for storm restoration. As you guys know, the snow melted within, what, a day was it? Pretty much melted off in these areas. So that actually helped. A lot of these trees, at the tops of these trees, had mowed all the way over. As the snow melted, they came off the lines. So that was a benefit. That was a lot of trees. But we did have a lot of trees that snapped. And as they snapped, a lot of them landed on our lines, which created a big risk for ourselves as well as the public. Our main transmission lines that feed the substations, all of our transmission lines start at power plants. We have power plants along the Delaware as well as the nuclear plant up in Berwick. And all these big transmission lines carry the power to what we call a substation, where we have transformers that step it down from the high voltage. We have lines that run in this area that are 500 kV, 500,000 volts. that step it down to what we call 138 kV or 69 kV, 69,000 volts. And those are the lines then that branch off around the region here that go to the substation here on Emmaus as well as other substations. When they reach those substations, we have other transformers that then step it down again. And they step it down to 12 kV, which is the residential primary lines that we have running across your town here when we have the three together. And then we have the little pot that's in at your house, residential transformer, that steps it down from 7.2 down to the residential power. So it's quite a system as it goes out. It's just like a bunch of finger branches off and comes out. It's a spider web of wires. So as these trees started to fall, if it came across some of these trees and wires, we have supporting what we call guy wires that keep the poles in a vertical fashion so they don't get pulled over in one direction if it's going around a bend. As these trees came down, trees hit those guy wires. Typically, the poles they're wood, so they're a bit flexible. They can bend a little bit. We can put weight on them and they'll bend. But if you hit it with enough force, like anything, it's going to snap. So our transmission lines started to snap when these trees came down, and when we get into these transmission lines, they're specialized crews that work with those transmission lines. So we have crews that work with our normal distribution lines that are in the neighborhoods here, but then for those big high lines, we have different crews that work on those that are specialized for that type of aspect of the job. So as I talked earlier, it's the 10-foot rule. Keep a minimum of 10 feet. If one way to tell how the voltage of our power lines is the insulators. If you see the lines that run down along 78, they're on the bigger poles, and there's multiple insulators stacked underneath them that are holding those lines up. The more insulators that are there, the higher voltage those lines are. Now, typically in your neighborhood here, there'd be 10 feet minimum from the power line. And I'll get into why it's a minimum of 10 feet. You might say, well, the power line's there, it's going right into the ground. Well, there is another factor that we need to watch out for that can be very dangerous to the public. So, one of the issues we have with the lines that travel over roadways and in towns like this in the wintertime is when the plow trucks come through. They keep their load of salt in the back of the truck. They're driving down the road. All of a sudden they realize that they need to get more salt to the back of the truck so that it goes out through the gate. Well, now they have their dump up in the air. When their dump's up in the air, it's a lot higher than their truck is normally. If they're not careful, they can put that dump up into our power lines, causing issues. As well as if they're driving down the road and contact the telephone wires, they have the potential of pulling those lines down on the road behind them. And we did have an occurrence of that on this past storm where a plow truck put his bucket up and caught the telephone wires and ended up snapping a couple poles. So it's just not the factor of the trees coming down the line. We also had another factor. We also had a lot of cars that were slipping and sliding around the roads. We had numerous pole hits during the snowstorm of cars coming and striking the poles. And that was another factor that just added to the numerous number of issues that we had on our system. This here's a picture of our three-phase lines, as well as what we call our residential transformers on a pole. Now I talked about the wires being on the ground, if they're still energized. Most people think that when that wire goes into the ground and that electricity is going into the ground, it's going straight in. The problem is it creates what we call a radius around that area, different potentials. Everybody's seen the bird sit on the power lines, correct? The bird can sit up there all day, you don't have any issues, right? That's because they're on the same potential. They're not providing a different path to ground. As that, if I was standing in the middle of that wire, and I'm maybe a foot from it now, and I take a step, the voltage that's going behind me is less here, but it's even less here. So what does electricity want to do? It's going to end up traveling through my body, water at least resistance, to the next potential. Because it wants to get this potential that I just stepped on up to the same potential as what's behind them. So that's one of the reasons sometimes you hear different firefighters go, I felt a little bit of tingling when I went to get the pole number. It's because when they went to get that pole number, they should have never been there. Now, if you do see wires on the ground, do you need to go up to the pole and look at the pole number that's in that area? Do we need that exact pole number? No. Because our lines are in a series. They're connected to each other and they run down the road. If the public or the fire department were to give us a pole number that's 3 or 4 poles up from where the hazard is, do you think we'd be able to find the issue? Absolutely. And that's one of the misconceptions the fire department has, is they like to go up to where the hazard is. And they put themselves at a lot of risk when they do that. And we've been doing a lot of training to make sure that they understand what the potential is. So if they were to give us a pole that's up the road a little bit, that's just as good as a pole where the hazard is. So we talked about the step potential, as well as touch potential now. Is everybody familiar with like a well drilling rig? That drills wells for public, you guys are on public water? Yep. I apologize, I live up in the mountains, I got a well and a mound and all that type of stuff. So, we had a well drilling rig down in the Bucksmont area, just a little bit south here in Montgomery County. They were drilling a well. They were having a good day. Well, the ground was a little bit softer where they were at. Their rig ended up tipping a bit. As it tipped through the soft ground in their outriggers, it came in contact with their lines. The operator of that rig stepped off the rig after it went over and didn't realize it was energized. What happens is he provided a pat to ground. He ended up getting shocked and was on the ground. Another co-worker came over to help him and started performing CPR on the individual. He was doing CPR, the individual doing CPR was okay. A third crew member came over. Failed to recognize that the drilling rig was still in contact with the power lines. And when he came over, he put his hand on the back of the individual doing CPR and then put his hand onto the drill rig. And all 3 individuals that day ended up passing away. So it's very, if you ever see a situation where somebody's down on the ground or see wire, keep distance. Keep distance. Do not rush into a situation because you do not know what potential is there still. If you see it's still in contact with lines, more than likely it's still energized. Our lines are designed to trip out with fault current, but if it's not providing enough fault current to that device, the lines are not going to trip out. Now, our system is very redundant as it goes back, so if a single phase line were to trip out, it just isolates that single phase line. Those single phase lines all come off of what we call our 3-phase lines. If we were to have an issue across those 3-phase lines, there's isolation points in there that have breakers or switches that keep it from traveling back any further than this device. So that it might affect customers up on this end of the town, but it won't travel all the way up that line, taking the whole town out. Now, in this storm here, we had so much damage, what ended up happening is it took out the lines all the way back to the circuit breakers or our substations. So all the lines worked as they were designed when they trip out. If you ever seen your lights flicker 3 times, real quick, that's our lines. Circuit breakers are designed to trip 3 times to where they trip once, they try to clear what's on the lines. It might be a small limb that came on the line, and when it re-trips and goes on, a lot of times you can throw that limb back off of the lines. But if it trips 3 times, it goes to what we call lockout, and now one of our individuals has to come out from the service center, check the line, control it, before they can do any type of work at resetting that breaker. Because last thing we want to do is trip that breaker back on and then have an issue down line. So a lot of what we do, and some of the reason it takes so long, is just for the public safety as well as our safety as we go out. If you had lines down your front yard and we were to re-energize it, it would be a heck of a fireworks show with those lines being down. So we always make sure before we put anything back in is we control the lines out. This is a picture actually from the ice storm this past winter. As you can see, the line runs through the woods a bit, and when the trees, this goes to a single residence back in the woods there. When the trees start getting that much ice, there's not much to keep them from snapping. So it's just one of the hazards. When you're working around, minimum is 10 feet. Ideally, if we can stay 30 feet or not even in that block, the fire department usually blocks it off, but as public, right, we're curious as always what's going on, and we want to get closer. But with power, you do not want to get closer because you put yourselves at a tremendous amount of risk when that does occur. As I said, never touch an attempted line. The police departments, they're not doing us a favor when they do that. They get extremely lucky. In this picture here, this is actually from down south, but we use it as a good educational lesson. We had the fire department. The fire department responded to this location. They got a call that they had a brush fire. Normal grass burning on the ground. What they failed to recognize was what caused the brush fire. It was a down power line. And when the individuals were out there extinguishing the fire, one of the firefighters ended up making contact with that line and was killed. So as we talk to the public as well as the fire departments is you got to look at the big picture. What caused the outage? What caused the issue? Because we have to identify what caused it before we can go fix the problem. So it's very important. Power is not something one wants to mess with. Everybody gets to feel that rubber glove. So it's like, if you were to put that on, it's not very easy to work with. You know, you don't have a lot of dexterity. But it's one of the factors that if we can still use it to be able to get enough grip on this equipment that we need to use so that when we do line restoration and we do it energized, everybody in the public stays in power. It wouldn't be very fair to the public every time we want them to do work on the lines and say, oh, we got to de-energize these lines so we can work on them now, right? It would be, we'd have numerous outages across the area all the time just for our crews doing general work on the lines. So a lot of the work we do is energized, and we can do that with protective equipment. And all of our bucket trucks have an insulated section in them that protects us as well. That's what we call our second barrier. We always make sure we have two barriers when we work with electricity, just in case a rubber glove or something were to fail. We still have that second barrier of the bucket truck to protect ourselves. So in reviewing, whenever we have an outage or we have lines down, just look around. Look at what's the issue. Don't put yourself in harm's way. Keep your distance. Minimum 10 feet. Great rule of thumb is 30 feet. But keep yourselves away from the issue. In the storm we had, the hurricane, we had a lot of issues up north. I run with a local fire company as well up in Pocono Township. And I heard over the scanner, an individual had a line come down in her front yard. And it was on the ground burning still energized. Well, she came out of her house and she wanted to get that line away from her house. Fortunately, she was not providing a good path to ground and she was standing in a lot of loose gravel. And she ended up touching that line. She only ended up getting burns on her hands. And fortunate that the electricity didn't travel through her body. But it was more from the fire burning in the area. Very fortunate individual. But when we talked to her, she didn't realize that that line still had potential. And we talk about potential a lot in the power company because there's a lot of risk involved in it and there's a lot of potential for things to be energized. We do have a lot of people that have solar panels up on their houses now. Do those solar panels have potential to backfeed our system? If some piece of equipment in that were to fail, with the switching? Absolutely. So just because the power's out one location doesn't mean, you know, we still you might have power on this side of the street, but the other side of the street doesn't. There's a lot of lines running, they could be intermingled. So we have to really identify what we have out there. And when we have a lot of wires on the ground and they're all mixed up, we got to make sure everything gets put back correctly so that the lines aren't cross-phased. We have 3 phases on our lines and that gets a little more technical. But we need to make sure everything lines up because when we go to re-energize that then, if things aren't lined up correctly, it's just going to cause a big mess and we're going to have more problems on our hands. So important, low voltage can even be fatal. This isn't meant to scare anybody, it's more of awareness to the public here. But our everyday lives, we don't notice the lines, right? Anybody ever drive to work and go right past their exit that they're supposed to get off at? I know I have, on my last job. And what happens is we get complacent, right? We're driving down those roads every day, we don't even notice the power lines a lot of times. We're going about our everyday lives. But when a storm hits like this, and there's power lines down, and there's a lot of power outages, we have to raise our awareness when we're around these lines to make sure that we do not put ourselves in hazardous conditions. So, anybody have any questions so far? Hit the lights, I'll put a little demonstration on here. I could get that other glove I know is floating around here. Right here. What's that? Hold up, 1 second. The question was, can you drive over the power lines? We do not recommend it. Because when power lines are on the ground, there's still the potential that they're energized, right? If a line were to kick up to your car, are you most likely safe? More than likely. Can you guarantee it? Not at all. Now, what occasion, if you have an auto accident, a power line were to come down on a car. Down in Lancaster earlier this year, we had an individual that an accident occurred on the other side of the street. She wasn't even involved in the accident because the power line came down on her car. She was a nurse at the local hospital and had some knowledge of how power works. She realized that where's the safest place to stay if a power line were to come on your car? In your car. She had 2 little kids with her. She kept them calm. Luckily, it was just around the corner from our service station, and we were able to get a crew out there within about 5 minutes. So she didn't have to stay there long, but she had the knowledge, and she was able to understand that the best place to stay is in that car. And it ended up being, nobody was injured. People were injured in the accident on the other side, but the individual that did not cause the accident had nothing to do with the accident. She was okay, and her kids were okay. So that was very important to us, and she had said that a presentation like this had brought knowledge to her at the hospital that we had done for her. So it's some of the good things, side of the job I like is doing education with the public and as well as the individuals that will interact with the line crews. I'm not one to be sitting behind a desk all day pushing paper, so. You have a question?
When that happens when the wires fall over your car, can you fix it?
If you're sitting in the car, you're at the same potential. So if you were to touch the metal of the car, more than likely, you can't guarantee it ever. Because with power, there's a lot of unknowns. The way cars are designed these days, there is, electric cars, there's different things. Depending on how things are set up, or if your car was in the accident and it's touching the ground. More than likely, the best place to stay is in your car. But you want to make sure you put the windows down, notify anybody that's around you to stay away. Because you don't want somebody coming up to say, are you okay? Because now what happened? That individual that came to check to see if you're okay just was hit with electricity. So it's not a very good situation to be in. A lot of times if our lines were to fall, we like to think they trip out right away. But we don't, until we get on scene, we can't tell you if those lines are de-energized going to that vehicle until we can visually look at it, and then we throw a ground up there to make sure that there is no potential backfeeding everything. A lot of people have these residential generators that automatically turn on when the power goes out. Well, those transfer boxes that are in those, that those people install with those generators, those can fail. All equipment can fail. Everything has potential to fail. So we have to treat it with the utmost caution whenever we're working around it. So,
In the middle of this big storm we just had, they kept saying, oh, well, we fixed up a line. As soon as we plugged it in, they blew the transformer. Why?
Now, as I said, we have a lot of foreign crews up here. Now, when the crews up in this area, I know one of the first crews that came up here, the foreman actually brought them down in town here and they started at the substation. When we were working our lines out, the crews were in here in this area getting the main lines back up. The problem was we had transmission lines. We had 10 issues with transmission lines in this area. So the transmission line in the substation was out. So even though our crews were in this area putting these lines back up, till we had the crews get additional lines and additional damage restored is when we could get these lines back energized. So it took a little bit of a while to be able to get the forces. We had guys from, we have our sister utility in Kentucky. We had a ton of contractors from Kentucky. We had crews from Alabama, Michigan, Ohio, Duke Energy, a few contractors from Western PA. A lot of them went up to the New England areas. But we had guys from North Carolina, Virginia, and Illinois. So we had a lot of contractors here from foreign locations. And not all electric systems are designed the same. So some of the systems that they're used to working on could be set up one way. We do give them information on how our system's energized and works. But when you have that many crews come up from foreign locations, you can't educate everybody 100%. So it's just another additional element that we have to watch out for. So, all right, we got as well. Now, if I just says these lines here are going to become energized, so I don't want anybody coming up to touch them while I have this on. Now you're looking at this and you see the ladder up in the line there. You might think, that never happened. Anybody ever see it happen? And usually the individuals, the reason they're doing it is they don't know. They think because their power's out that those lines are de-energized. But do we know for sure? No. Until we can make sure we have our visual breaks and our grounding, we don't treat those lines as de-energized. So does that individual run a risk when he puts that ladder up into the line? Absolutely. Now everyone sees the arc going here, right? I can slide this right up and through. Electricity, you don't necessarily have to touch it. It can travel through the air through to that person. And a lot of times when we have higher voltages and we do switching, you draw a bigger arc. So it's that's why when we say 10 feet minimum, electricity has the potential to travel through the air. When we get a lot of our higher voltages and we open switches in the substations that transfer power and loads, a lot of those switches, when they open, they're rigged so that when we crank them, they swing open quickly. So that that arc gets snuffed quicker. If we were to move it slow, like I did here, you start to draw an arc. So it's very, the electric business, you got a lot of risk to it, and that's why we use the equipment we use when we're working around it, and the practices we do. Anybody want to take a guess at how deep the underground lines are if you have underground power feeding your house? We typically put them down about 3 feet. We found our lines as deep as 20 feet when we go looking for them. And we found them as shallow as below the surface, just below, under a rock. Because what typically happens is when we put our power lines in underground, what's the contractor come and do? They come and regrade the yards, or people have their yards redone, or add soil in, or take soil out. And a lot of times they're not thinking, I'm digging. But when they move that soil, are they raising the height and depth of those lines? Absolutely. So whenever you're digging in your yard even, putting a shrub, it's important to know where your power lines run if they're underground. Because it doesn't take much to put a shovel in the ground. And when your house was built, if you didn't build it, you don't know how deep that line was in. We put it in 3 feet, but it doesn't say that the guys came in and said we wanted to plant a tree next to it and had to remove some dirt or add a bunch of dirt in around it. So it's one of the factors we have a lot of times when we have underground faults is when we go to locate these lines, we could be digging down a foot, or you might need to dig down 7, 8 feet to find lines. It just varies on the area. So one of the hazards we have with contractors is they come in contact with our lines. Now, we have a system in place called PA1 call in PA. And what it is, one of our locators comes out and identifies with red markings where our power lines run underground. Problem is, not all contractors use that. And they dig into our lines. When they dig into our lines, it could be primary lines, or it could be just the residential lines going to the house. But do they always know when they come in contact with those lines? If it sparks, they'll know. If it doesn't, they could still be in contact with it. Another individual comes up to talk to that operator and touches that piece of equipment. Operator might never know. That's why it's important when you have equipment operating around an area, no matter if it's little equipment or bigger equipment, that you have an idea of what the operator is doing and where they're digging at. Ideally, you want to call PA1 call to get a mark and locate to make sure that you're not going to be digging into an area. And whenever we set a pole or have a pole hit, we had a lot of poles snap on this past storm. Whenever we're out there, even though we're the utility company and on the power side, there's other utilities that are under the ground, sewer, gas, and things like that. And we also have to be cautious and aware of what their utilities are. We don't want to be digging into those. So whenever we have to reset a pole, if we have to reset it right next to that pole, us as a utility, we have to follow PA1 call. Now, if there's an emergency situation, we have to wait a minimum of 2 hours before we can replace that pole. We have to give those other utilities adequate time to respond out to where we're going to be setting that pole. So a lot of times you might see our crews, they're at the location. Usually when they'll get there, they'll call in that pole number right away, a PA1 call, and get the ball rolling while they're getting all their equipment set up, so it helps cut down the time. But sometimes we'll have to wait for other utilities to come out there to identify where the lines are, so that when we start digging for our pole to set, we're not going to dig into that gas line and cause another additional hazard in the location. So this is another factor that plays into what we do out there. I will pass around some of what our overhead wire is. This is what we call our triplex. It's 3 wires. This is typically what runs from your transformer on the pole to your house. As you can see, it's not very flexible. But our guys need it, when that enters the house, they need to shape it. So it takes a little bit of force to make sure to make those bends to get that into the proper shape when they're shaping it into your house. Anybody want to take a guess at what our #1 cause of outage is? Well, in normal years.
Squirrels.
We got squirrels. Well, I brought my pet squirrel with me today.
Automobile.
So squirrels are mainly our #1 cause of outages. What we have done in recent years is put what we call squirrel guarding up inside our substations, or animal guard. And what it does is it goes around our insulators, which would be our a couple rings that isolate it from the point of that's energized. So if an animal were to climb up that steel structure, they can't get to the energized part of it. There's usually a red ring around it that if the animal were to contact it, it's basically like what an electric fence would be like with the deer, is it gives them a little zap to get them away from the high voltage that would kill them. So it's animal-friendly stuff, but it keeps them from contacting our energized facilities, which would cause big outages. If a raccoon were to get on top of one of our big transformers at a substation and make contact between the different phases that came out of that, it would cause a big outage. It would put the whole town out. So it's important that we get around and put that animal guard on, as well as a lot of the transformers on our poles. We do put plastic bushings, or plastic around the bushings, as well as that metal that comes up to the main line here. We put a hose up around that. There's rubber or plastic hose, and all that is just to keep the squirrel that when he's sitting on top of this transformer and touching that, he's okay, and it doesn't trip your transformer out. But every now and then the squirrels seem to find a way. If they're dancing on top of the lines, you'll see them running up and down the lines during the summer, having a good old time. But if they were to come in contact with the top of one of our pots as they jumped off with their bushy tails, our troubleman, if it's one single location, first thing he does when he gets to that location is going to look on the ground. We're going to identify, make sure no wires are on the ground. But if he sees a squirrel sitting on the ground there, that's going to be the most likely cause. A lot of times squirrels, they have big bushy tails, right? If they were to make contact, a lot of times their tail is what makes the contact with it. And a lot of times squirrels do survive, or we'll find a piece of the tail on the ground nearby. But we have done a lot in past years here to protect against these squirrel guards, as what we call them, animal contact. In some areas, up north by like Lake Wallenpaupack, where we have a lot of the bigger birds of prey, we do have locations on our transmission lines where we actually put in barriers up around those transmission lines, so that when those big the birds spread their wings that have the 6-7 foot wingspan as they go, they don't come in contact and ground themselves out, and then they end up, don't get hurt. So it's one of the other factors that we have in the business, and as well as the public safety. Now, we got any water in the back here? Now this is a dry stick. It's just basically been sitting in the box here for the past couple weeks. All I'm going to do is run a little bit of water over this stick. Doesn't take much. So it's just a little bit of water. So if you had a tree that fell across the lines, and it maybe wasn't raining when it fell, you can see what a little bit of moisture does. So just a little bit of moisture on the stick can cause electricity to track through it. If it's a dry day, less likely to track through the stick. If it's a green, live tree, a lot of moisture in that tree yet, more likely to track through it. Dead branch like this one, it's been sitting a while, not much moisture in it, but I put a little bit of moisture just on it. If it was rainy or humid out, and now it tracks through it. So it's just an additional element. It might be safe. It might not look like it's arcing at one point through the day, but if it gets humid at night, or if it gets starts to mist a little bit, does that tree now have a higher potential of being energized? Absolutely. So it's just another factor we got to watch out for as when trees come down the line. So, anybody have any questions after that?
When they have the generator running,
Yes.
when the power comes on, who is supposed to shut the generator off?
It depends on how the individuals have their generators hooked up. If they have them hooked up with what they call a transfer switch, power comes back on, it kicks the generator back off. When people hook up their generators, if they have what they call portable generators used for construction and other that you can roll around, when people plug those in, it's important that if they're just plugging them into an outlet, that they flip what they call their main breaker in their house. So if they don't flip that main, now when they're backfeeding the line, when we ground out our lines to make sure that we don't have any backfeed, it's going to superload that generator, and that generator is going to end up blowing a fuse. And so a lot of times when we do put the line, if we ground out the line, if it's not hooked up properly, that the generator, if it's backfeeding the line, it's most likely going to shut off. But if people flip that main in there and the power comes back on, those individuals are still going to be running off that generator until they come back and disconnect their generator and then flip their main back to on. So there is devices out there that do it automatically if the house is equipped with that, but if it's not, people are just flip their main off to make sure that it doesn't backfeed into the system. No, if you're plugging in,
Can you repeat her question so we can hear what she said?
okay. What she just asked is, if you had your refrigerator plugged directly, like doing an extension cord running directly to your refrigerator, and didn't have your generator plugged into the house, is your refrigerator okay running off that generator? Yes, because it's not connected to the main part of your electrical system inside the house. So, yes. question. Got it? So, if we take one thing away tonight, if you guys have down power lines, please stay away until our crews get out there to make sure that they're de-energized. When we have mass incidents like this where these lines are down on the ground, we understand it's difficult and we're out there trying to get it on. I live up in the Poconos, and when I called up to get a hotel that night, closest hotel they said they could get me was in Bartonsville, which was about 3 miles from my house. So it was an extremely long week for all of us. We had a lot of guys that put in a lot of hours, and we had crews working mainly around the clock. But as you know, majority of our work, we can get a lot more work done during daylight hours than we can at nighttime hours. So we try to work the majority of our crews during the day, but we did have crews working all through the night as well, just depending on what their cycle was in the rotation. We don't allow our guys to work more than 18 hours in one shop. The reason that is just fatigue, and when you're working with electricity, a high hazard, and you start to get fatigued, it's a very dangerous situation, and if you make a mistake, it could be fatal. So we work our guys up to a maximum of 18 hours, and then they're off for 6 hours, and usually back working by 8 hours. So it's one of those rotations. We understand it's difficult when you're out of power, and we don't have crews out there around, full staff like that around the clock. But a lot of times it's easier for us to work our crews mainly during the daylight hours when we had the mass. But we did have a couple hundred guys that were just the way that when they came on the system, they were working all through the night hours and then off during the daytime. So we had guys working all over. Fortunately, through this storm, we did not have any individuals reported to us that had contacted any lines, and we had a couple of injuries where when we have trees on the lines, they put a lot of tension on these lines, and they start to bow in. So when you have a tree on that, as you start to remove weight off that tree, these lines naturally want to come back up. So you got a lot of force. Physics, when you do a sudden release of that energy, things are going to fly. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll take a rope, we'll tie it around these lines, and pull tension down on these lines to control that energy. So when we cut that tree, it's a controlled release so that it's not throwing that tree onto somebody. We did have a couple instances where trees, as the guys were cutting them, depending on the terrain, trees tend to slide on our lines. And we did have 2 individuals that were struck by trees while trying to remove them. Fortunately, they were not severely injured, and they went to the hospital and got checked out. But it's just one of the additional elements and factors that we have to face when we're out there is the control of the energy. Not only the electrical energy, but as well as the physical energy built up. So, anybody have any other questions?
What about just during normal circumstances? That these power lines going to people's homes, buildings, and sometimes they'll pass through trees. What happens when they touch the trees? Is that dangerous?
This is your triplex. So on the triplex, you have the tree guard. So majority of the time, if your lines are running through, you have a tree guard, and there's not much potential. Now, as lines grow in, we trim our primary lines. In your notices, if you get electronic emails or the notices through the mail, we send notices that once this line comes from the transformer to your house, the resident is responsible for the tree trimming of that line. Now you might ask, how do I go about doing that? What the best way to do is, and a lot of tree companies know this, but individuals doing their own trimming might not, is call a PPL, arrange for what we call an outage at your residence. And what we'll do is we'll come de-energize this transformer to your house so that individuals can come safely trim those trees around your line going to your house. So the number there is to dial 1-800 dial PPL and set up an arrangement if you want to go about doing that. So.
You mentioned that 10-foot gold stand was 10 feet away. Is that just a line that's snapped, or is it staying 10 feet away from a normal line?
Good question.
It's not that's intact.
Now, if we had a normal line, if somebody's operating a crane in an area, or doing tree trimming, or even in the city, where we have our lines running down the street and you have the buildings right next to it, do you always have 10 feet?
No.
No. They were doing work on the jail down in downtown Allentown, and they had to put a scaffold on the side of that building. Well, when they put this scaffold that rode up and down on the wires, they would have been within about a foot of our lines. Problem. What do you do? We ended up having to reroute our lines to the other side of the street. Take these lines, de-energize them, so that they could complete their construction project. And we do a lot of stuff like that on construction projects, of rerouting the way our lines go to make sure that individuals are able to maintain their clearances. It's just one of the elements of the utility business that we need to make sure we respect, because power doesn't care who you are, what you do. It's really unforgiving. So if a crane were moving, the OSHA standard for cranes now in derricks is 20 feet. Unless the lines are de-energized, at that time they can get closer. But the typical rule of thumb for excavators and things like that, if the lines are in normal condition, it's 10 feet around. It's just not 10 feet on this side, and on the bottom, it's 10 feet on top as well. People don't understand that. You know, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I'm going over the lines. You got to keep a 10-foot distance. Electricity can travel through air, as you know, static electricity and things like that. So you got to keep a minimum of 10-foot radius around those lines, even in normal circumstances, as well as on the ground. So
something we never realized, but you know, we cleaned our gutters, you know, around the house, the gutters, catch the rain.
correct.
And power lines are just maybe 2 feet away, 2, 3 feet away from those gutters.
Correct.
So actually, it's probably dangerous to clean the gutters near the power lines. Is that right?
If you come in to your house, the way they come into the weatherhead and everything, when you're getting the gutters, you don't want to, if you're putting a ladder up, you don't want to be close, real close to where that is in the gutter. One of the best ways people clean gutters is they use the wands with the hose with the water in the air. Well, what's happening when they're in the air with that water hose? You're attached to the water, and now you're spraying a water stream, a solid stream of water that has potential coming into contact with the line. Very hazardous. So there's a lot of things that you guys do in your everyday lives that run a potential with electricity. And I'm sure you've gone through most of your lives, and I know before I got into the power business, I took it for granted. I flipped my switch on, and I flipped it off, and that's all I knew. Once I got into the power business, there was, wow, that does this, that can do that. So it was a real big knowledge learning gap for me to learn when I got into the business, because I just didn't know. I grew up around power, and it was just there. So great questions. Any others? I don't want to be boring anybody, but hopefully, so
Very much.
I appreciate you guys having me out here tonight. Thank you so much. Now, I did talk to a couple members of the group beforehand, and I know some of you guys expressed concern about the power outages, things like that. If you'd like to have a speaker come talk about, from our public relations group, a little bit more about some of the tactics that we do to get our lines back up and how we restore them, we can arrange that at some point too. You can just dial up through Dial PPL, and they'd be able to give you the aspect from the PR public relations side about how we do our line restorations. On my side, I concentrate on safety as public knowledge for individuals, and hopefully you guys took something from it tonight, and I appreciate you having me out here. Thank you.
Has our other guest arrived yet, Michael?
Kevin's here.
Okay. We'll have the next speaker, which is Michael Birch.
Hi, Doug. Good. Thanks for coming.
Hi, my name is Kevin Farnish, and just to tell you a little bit about me and my experiences. I've been in the volunteer fire service for 35 years now. I've currently been with the Emmaus Fire Department for 8 years. I do your fire inspections here in town, and as of March of this year, I became the EMA director for Emmaus. And for those that don't know what the EMA director does, whether it be on the borough level, county level, eventually we go to state as well as up to the federal government. And As you know, here in town, you have fire, police, ambulance, you have your public works departments. And what the EMA director basically does is we stay in touch with those different agencies, and if something would be beyond the scope of, say, the public works department, we could then call for the county to help us, to say we need some help here in Emmaus, and you know, we would tap into those resources. If it's a situation where the county says, well, you know, Emmaus, that's a little bit beyond us, let us get in touch with the state who has greater resources. And then obviously the group called FEMA is who we turn to in situations where it's even beyond the reaches of the state. All right. With the hurricane that came through, there was flooding, there was power outages. That was a much more widespread event than the most recent snowstorm. All right. I was in Coopersburg, that's where I live. I was without power for 5 days. And, you know, it's just one of those things that, you know, when the power goes out, in my house I had no running water because I'm on well water and stuff like that. But it's just a situation where the hurricane was more widespread because it was followed up by the tropical storm Lee, which actually our boat from here in Emmaus, we did mutual aid. Another gentleman and I spent 10 hours out near Lebanon County, about an hour's ride from here, doing water rescues where the water was up to people's roofs. We were taking people off the roofs, basically. And that was much more widespread, so FEMA got involved, which is the national level, because that was more or less up and down the East Coast. This snowstorm that we just had, Emmaus, Center Valley, it was much more isolated. Coopersburg, all right, we had about 14 inches where I lived. And what happened is that it wasn't widespread enough to bring in FEMA to get more help, is basically what it amounts to, all right? So what took place with the power outage is simply that even our neighbors, and in the fire service we call for mutual aid a lot, the police departments, ambulance corps. Well, the power outage was so great that we couldn't look to the neighbors and say, well, if you go a couple miles down the road, there would be an open building that's warm, they can provide food, they can cook. Everybody was more or less in the same boat, all right? The county, when we went to the county for help, they basically said, well, listen, from what we understand, it might be a short-lived type of scenario. The best thing to do is to what they call shelter in place. In other words, keep people in their homes. You know, hopefully they've taken the steps to prepare for an emergency, possibly not as long as 5 to 6 days as some of us did, but for several days. All right. I'm not sure at what point some people got power. I know some people in Coopersburg got power Sunday night. They got Monday night. I didn't get it till Thursday night, almost a complete week. All right. Not that I was home anyway. I was out helping people doing the fire service stuff. A couple of things. I know Jim Rice, the fire chief, was supposed to be here. He was going to, there's a few things that we can go over. And a lot of this, when my experience in the last couple months working with the county and stuff, is that how well are we prepared on a local level? And that local level starts at your home, all right? In other words, do you have batteries for flashlights? Do you have a battery-operated radio? So that, I know a lot of people were giving out information like when you go to the internet and get information as to where to go and what to do. Well, if I don't have power, I can't turn my computer on. All right? So again, having, you know, backup sources, cell phones. A lot of us have all gone to cell phones. I don't have a regular phone anymore that I hang up on the wall. All right? So, you know, fortunately, again, in my situation, situation, I'm out with the fire department and we have generators and things like that, so we can charge these phones up. In your particular case, if you have a cell phone or you know relatives that have cell phones, that became an issue after a while that you couldn't even call a friend for help. All right. Now, one of the things here in Emmaus, that if you do live in Emmaus, and you know the little red boxes you see on the telephone poles or the power poles, all right, that system called the Gainwell system was operational. That if you had an emergency and you go out and pull that, now it does say fire, but hey, if you need the police in this scenario, you need the police, you need an ambulance, you pull that, you pull the box, pull the lever, that signals the station as to where we would then come for someone who needs help. So if you're within a short distance of that, that was an alternative. A lot of people may not have known that that was up and running, okay? But let me just ask you this. Recently we changed our clocks, correct? How many people here have smoke detectors, and did you change your batteries? I mean, that's one of the little things I teach fire prevention. And it's like, well, okay, that may seem unrelated to what we're talking about right now, but that's one of the simplest things that you should do twice a year. So it's sort of like, well, twice a year we change our clocks. Probably the best invention to preventing people from dying in a fire is those little smoke detectors. Again, think about it. You know, did you change your batteries? All right. I realize there's a lot of older people in the room, much older than myself. Maybe you have a nephew, a niece, a friend. All right. I'll even come out and change your batteries if need be. All right. Because we have the means to get up. I don't need, you know, Mike sitting back there in EMS doesn't need to have a call because Kevin said, okay, I got to reach up and change my battery. I'd rather come out, make a personal call, change your batteries, and feel better about it. Okay. Than rather you going up trying to change batteries and get hurt. It's just something that. Sure.
If you're hooked up, like when the hospice is at my place, you're hooked up into the electrical system.
Correct.
What happens then?
You don't have it.
You don't have it.
Correct. Right. His question was is that if what we call hardwired. So if these detectors, like the ones up here, if they're actually, and these are probably hardwired, obviously, they wouldn't be changing all these batteries. But if there's no power, that system goes down as well. Now, the alarm panel, that if we went to where the alarm panel is located, they should have a battery backup that should last a little while. It's probably not going to last 5 or 6 days like some of us experience. All right? But that is a requirement. That is something that I check when I do my fire inspections. We go to the box to make sure that these alarm companies that you're depending on are changing their batteries on a regular basis. Okay? So getting back to what we can do personally is some of the things to do is to have the extra batteries, have a call list of people that you could call or that would call and check on you. All right? Kind of the buddy system. Firefighting, we always work in teams of at least 2, all right? I get in trouble, my partner can help me out. So if you have a friend, a neighbor that you can talk to, let them know your situation. EMS will tell you that, you know, have a list of your meds, that if you do have to be evacuated, that you can grab a little case with medicines in, the phone numbers, the contacts. Because again, someone may come, if we move you from a location, someone may come looking for you. All right? You might want to have those numbers so that we can call and let them know that you've been relocated to a safe place. Some things that that people do in the time of need is, we've talked about these portable generators. We've talked about people will get portable generators, they run down to Home Depot or they run to a rental place and they don't necessarily know the do's and don'ts. I know myself, probably we experienced about 10 people that were overcome by carbon monoxide, the silent killer. They thought, oh, we rented a generator, we don't want it to be out in the snow, they put it in the basement. They think that's okay. After running for a while, it fills up the house with CO, and obviously it can kill you. All right. We had people that put the little hibachi grills, and they took charcoal, and they thought, oh, well, we'll just put a hibachi grill in each of the rooms, the kids' bedroom, the master bedroom, the living room. Again, anything that's combustible, whether it's a gas burner, propane, firewood, fireplace, anything that gives off that combustible gases, it creates carbon monoxide, and that can kill you. All right, just when you think you're getting tired or sleepy, all right, and everybody's feeling that way, there's a good chance that it might be carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, if you have any of those gas stoves, gas heaters, kerosene heaters, fireplace, anything that's combustible like that, along with the smoke detectors, they make what are called carbon monoxide detectors. And again, that would be something that you would put in your home so that, okay, you don't use the fireplace that often, maybe you didn't use the chimney for a while. Just as the power company experiences squirrels, believe it or not, they'll nest in your chimney when you're not using it. Birds will build nests. We've had raccoons that the mother's nesting in there and somebody finally builds a fire, and we actually plucked 3 baby raccoons out, plus the mom, and the people could understand why the smoke wasn't going out the chimney. It's because the raccoon built the nest. It's just little things like that that, you know, when things of this nature happen, people don't take into consideration. Another incident which has nothing to do with fires and propane or anything, but potentially can be an issue, is in Coopersburg, Sunday night, less than 20, probably a little over 24 hours after the power went out. The power in Coopersburg, apparently at this person's house, they were cooking. Well, when the power went out, they thought, oh, okay, I guess that ends cooking. They never turned off the stove. So a day later, when they're sitting around and the power finally comes on, smoke's billowing out of the kitchen, they don't understand what happened. Well, the food they left there the day before, all right, that they were in the process of making, the oven may have been on. Well, that oven came on, and a couple hours later, you know, it warmed up the food, started burning the food, and, you know, fortunately they were home and we prevented a major incident. But again, if that would be something that would happen, turn off your appliances. Make sure you've turned off, especially if you're cooking. Lights, lamps, no problem. All right, they'll just come back on as normal. But that cooking could be an issue. How many people have emergency plans? All right. There's a few hands in the room that go up. And again, it's something where you should have, you know, extra phone numbers, extra batteries. We can provide you with some information as a group. There are some websites, and maybe not everybody has a computer, but we can get you the brochures. We can print out the brochures. It's information that we take offline that will give you a list. It's actually a little checklist that you can go down. I've got batteries. I've got 3 days worth of water. I've got canned goods, all right, that you can keep. All right, some people may have gas stoves. You can use your gas stove, all right, so you could make soup or something. Something that would be preserved, that'll last. If the power does go out, you can go to eat. Some people have questions about, well, what do I do with my pets? Some of the shelters and stuff, when they're set up, that is something that they provide for. All right. So again, what you might want to keep in mind, since it is only November and probably the worst weather undoubtedly is ahead of us, some things you might want to think about is having a specific bag in case you would have to move or in case we would go through this again. All all right? Have some things maybe set aside that you can just grab and say, okay, I grab my bag, I grab a bag for my pet with a leash, maybe some snacks and stuff. Just to be a little bit prepared rather than stumbling through saying, well, okay, you know, now I need to find this, that, or the other thing to put a bag together. You have to keep in mind, if it is a scenario where we just had, it could be widespread, so you're not going to be able to say, well, I don't have power, but if I run over to Drexler Town, I'll go to the store over there. That may not be an option, and that wasn't an option, okay? So, any questions? Yes.
Not a question, just two things. You were talking about the can opener. I live at Bridge Manor.
Okay.
People complain they don't have, all they have are electric can openers.
Right.
Power goes out, you can have all the can food you want.
Good point.
And the other thing that I learned from living in San Francisco, on the San Andreas fault, as stupid as it sounds, when you have your list for preparedness, what you take with you, you have false teeth. Remember to take your teeth. I know it sounds stupid, but it's in the actual plans in San Francisco.
Right. And see, those are the little details that you don't necessarily think of. Like I mentioned the canned goods. Well, you know, we don't have power. How do you open a can? So, I mean, you know, those are the types of things that. Yes.
You mentioned something about having an emergency plan. Well, are there booklets or flyers that go out to the people so they have that list in front of them, putting things together, or what to do, what not to do?
Yes,
It's good hearing it verbally, but I mean,
right.
are there,
Right.
is there something in black and white that can go out?
Correct. There are, for those of you that have a computer, if not, if you need 50 copies, I'll make sure that we get 50 copies and bring them here, all right? So that you can, because I know not everybody has a computer, all right? And again, a lot of this stuff, I mean, we can order them. They'll send them from Harrisburg, they'll send them from the federal government, or you can go online and print out a 2-page checklist in 2 minutes. And all I have to do is print them out and say, okay, we need 50 copies, we'll get 50 copies made and drop them off to you. If that makes it easier for everybody. Yes.
What is the borough of Venice doing to educate the public? The fact that we now have an emergency management team and supposedly a functioning one. Is the borough itself doing anything to educate the people?
I don't know what has been done in the past. I believe on the website there's a contact number, all right? And again, one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that the emergency management department is more or less the go-between the borough and the county, all right? And again, what we've found, and again, I've been doing this 35 years, and most of you probably, we've never experienced an outage that is nearly a week long, all right? An outage that a lot of the facilities, the high-rises, the schools, the churches, a lot of evacuation plans, pre-planning that we have numbers of churches to call and the school district to call, all right? No one had heat, and that was becoming an issue. Thank God it wasn't in the middle of January. Basically what happened is we had a snowstorm where it was cold enough to have snow for 24 hours, but the next day it was 50, the following day it was 50, and that was a big concern that these buildings are getting colder as time goes on, all right? And the emergency management department is to assist that if the fire department needs help, then we get involved and say, okay, it's beyond the fire department, the local fire department's resources, we need to go to the county level, all right? Your first steps would be having your own, and again, I'll provide the information, having your own emergency plan in place. If you can go to a relative's house, all right? My brothers live down near Philadelphia. they had 3 inches of snow. My brother got a generator because he loses power because we have a 5-minute thunderstorm. During the hurricane and the snowstorm, he never lost power. So it's really hard to say what's going to happen and where you need to go. But you know, some of those options is something you should look at now, that if we would have another event, you have a relative maybe in New Jersey. Maybe they are only 40 or 50 miles away, and it's a short, you know, hour trip up or down the turnpike, depending on the situation. And they're all different. And that's why it's very hard to have all the answers or say this is going to work every time, because it doesn't. And I know from looking through the pre-planning here in Emmaus, there are churches that we have as shelters, but it was such a wide outage that the shelters didn't have the resources. Yes?
You know that 911 does not even know you exist? I called from the building that I'm in, and I started making the calls, and I was put through to 911. They have no idea who you were or that anything even existed here in Emmaus. I eventually was hooked into the police department. Was it Sergeant Horst? Or I don't know what his name was. He's the one that told me about you. He said that he would in turn contact him. Communication Center did not even know that anything existed here in Emmaus.
Right. Well, and that, again, and here's another issue that came up, that a lot of people were calling the police department, and the police department's phones were down. Well, the generator went bad, and believe me, you know, you should be on the other end of a fire hose when the fire truck doesn't give water to you. Okay? then you go out and say, what are you doing? But, you know, nothing, and just like this gentleman said with the power, I mean, they do double insulating, all right? That's why the fire department, you know, the rule is 2 guys go in, there should be 2 guys outside. That if they get in trouble, there's somebody outside to help them. Well, in the case with the police department, people are used to calling the local office and getting a response. Well, when the battery backups went down, there was nothing to keep the phone, you know, the age of electronics, all right, that becomes an issue. When there was no power, eventually the batteries go, so the phones couldn't be picked up down there. The forwarding system, where they get switched over to the county control center, that wasn't working. So people are flagging down officers saying, I need an officer, but I can't call the police department. That's why they have 911. All right? You call 911 if you have an emergency. Police, fire, whatever it is, ambulance, all right? That way, the people that dispatch us, you call them right away. All right? Now again, if you have an electric phone, and a lot of people have those phones that's electric, you plug it in, it's your voice recorder and everything, it's conceivable that that wasn't working.
Okay, what I'm saying is I got through, I started very early in the process, being in the senior high rise.
Huh?
When I was put through, when I called 911,
Right.
they told me that Emmaus had nothing, and they connected me to the police department, who I spoke to, and they in turn told me. What I'm saying, communications, and before any of the lines went down, any trouble with the phones, they had no idea if there was anything here in Emmaus until I called them back again.
Right. And again, I mean, I'm not, to be honest with you, I'm not the first person you call. All right? It's the police, fire, and ambulance is who you call. When it's beyond their scope, that's where EMA comes in to help them out on a local level. All right? Then we go to the county, as I said before. So if you ever have any doubt, call 911. All right? They will get you emergency services faster than anything else that I can recommend. Yes?
I live where I live now, 47 years, I've never seen it this bad. It's a half-mile going across the road, there were trees down all over.
Right.
You couldn't get out unless somebody would come and you walk in the snow.
Right.
There were trees down the street.
Right.
I got a chainsaw, I got something way out, and something like that.
Right.
Just in.
Right.
And that was just over the hill here, over side of the building, on top of the hill there.
Right.
So I had a generator, I run it 4 on, 4 off, and stuff like that. I kept going, but I was about like 4 or 5 years to do so. But when you got trees, there were so many here and there. When they did cut ours, you go another mile through that way, there was another one down, you know, it's rough to get out.
Right. Exactly. You know, I'll tell you a little funny story that happened, and he had mentioned about, you know, trying to get out and stuff like that. And depending on how severe things are, the best place for you to be is staying home, all right? And, you know, what that does is like, you know, for instance, you know, he mentioned about it's hard enough that you have power poles that are being brought down by Mother Nature. Then you have people that say, well, I can drive in this stuff, so why don't I just go out? And then they hit another pole. Now what that does is that means now the fire department and EMS people have to put their lives on the line for someone who should have bought milk or groceries and been saying, okay, I should be a little bit prepared that I don't need to run out immediately, okay, to get something to eat. So during this snowstorm, that Saturday night, everybody was without power, although, you know, part of Coopersburg, for whatever reason, the Burger King had power. So, you know, our firefighters are out there already about 12 or 14 hours into this, and they're hungry, all right? Our fire station, we were in the midst of converting to a bigger generator to run more things, so we didn't have power. So we said, okay, go to Burger King, order a bunch of food, we'll feed everybody. So my one guy, he's an older gentleman, he drives and he's been around forever as well, and he gets done ordering, and they've got about 6, 8 bags, big bags of food to bring back for all the other firefighters, and he turns around and the place is packed. And he says, folks, why are you out here? It's a snowstorm. Most people, there's power outages, trees are down. And what was really eerie, depending on whether you went out or not, you could hear the trees cracking. And then all of you heard, suddenly you heard a whoosh where it came down, and you're saying, wow, you know, you just hope nobody's there. So he says, listen, folks, you know, we've got to come out. I pulled a lady, you know, out of the ditch. And I said, man, where are you going? She's like, well, my mom needs help. I'm like, okay. And she goes, I know I shouldn't have come out. My son's with my mom. Why, your son is with your mom. Why are you risking your life when you know she's safe? She's got a young man with her, okay? But it's stuff like that. So this gentleman says, folks, you know, you really shouldn't be out here. You're putting we're doing the best we can. We're helping the power companies, you know, with true emergencies. And a lady goes, well, I live in Hellertown. I haven't had breakfast this morning because we lost power early on, and we're hungry. At that moment, Burger King went dead dark. No one else got food except our firefighters. And they said, folks, we're sorry, but we've got to leave. So that lady, again, you know, rather than being prepared and having something at home, drove 5 or 6 miles through this snowstorm, gets over to a place where she heard somewhere, at least I guess she had a radio or somebody on a cell phone told her, come to Coopersburg and you can eat. She never got her food. So now she had to either go to Quakertown, who we knew didn't have power because, you know, we work with the neighboring companies. But again, it's like you're risking so much rather than saying, okay, what do we need to do? Let's be prepared. You know, I'm prepared. Let's see if my neighbor's prepared. You know, that type of thing. Yes?
Talk about the high rise.
Uh-huh.
Who gives the instructions that they must evacuate when it's too cold for them? I understand they had heat in the hallway, but not in their separate room.
Correct.
Now, who gives the instructions to evacuate that building?
This is Mike Nonmaker.
I know Mike.
Okay. Well, he's been sitting here. I my best tonight. Yeah. He's been very patient sitting back there. And, you know, he can explain to you how we went how his crews went door to door and checking on people. But let him tell you the number of people he potentially could have moved
And how many people actually did them?
How many people in here are stubborn? How many people, I had a lady tell me, when we said, ma'am, you need to really seriously consider being transported to the warming center or the facility. As Kevin stated, we were all in the soup. Actually, we were in the snow, but not the soup. We had a situation where we had no power, and we had no place that was warm. The fire station has a generator, but there's no heat. There was enough for lights, and we occasionally were able to plug a coffee pot in to keep us fueled so we could keep going. We were watching the temperatures. We were monitoring the temperatures on each of the floors. Now, my responsibility as chief of EMS is to make sure that you all are medically safe. When the temperature drops, we got problems. And we were watching the temperatures in the high risers because that's where the largest amount of people were compiled. The four, East Penn Place 1 and 2, Ridge Manor 1 and 2, there's about 200 residents. We went through Saturday night, we went through Sunday all day, we went through Sunday night, Monday all day, into Monday night. We made the decision, I made the decision to say we need to put these people someplace because the temperature was dropping. It was about 48 degrees as of Monday night. Now we have people that are in electric wheelchairs. We have people that have oxygen that need to have electric to generate the O2. We have people that need, various medical needs, and those were the ones we were concentrating on. Now, out of 200 people in those 4 high-rises, how many people do you think actually, without being tied up and drug out of the building, wanted to go to a shelter?
Well, I can tell you in Ridge Manor.
I know you know the answer. Who else could guess?
None.
13. In the entire county system of housing, which is probably 9 facilities, there were 22 people that agreed to be evacuated. Now I have to tell you folks, I had a lady tell me, I am not leaving, and you can pry my cold hands off my doorknob before I leave my house. And at that point, after 68 hours of no sleep, I said, ma'am, if that's what you want, then that's what you're going to probably end up with because it's getting cold. If we ask you to do something, it's not that we're trying to force a hardship on you, but we're trying to make sure that you make it through the night. We had cold exposures. We had carbon monoxide deaths. We had people that died from carbon monoxide poisoning. From 11 o'clock Saturday morning through Tuesday at 3 o'clock, we had 46 ambulance calls. Now we're out in the weather, and I got to tell you, Saturday night it was eerie out there. The power was off, the trees were cracking. We went around and checked on people in the community that were on oxygen that needed oxygen. I personally was out all night long, going from house to house, and we know. We have a list of 170 people that we have on our special needs list. In Emmaus and then in Upper Milford, there's about 60. We made contact or tried to contact each of those people to stay up with it. The problem is if it gets too cold, you need to go. Now, where we were going to go, we weren't sure. We had a place in Orfield, up Kernsville School, that had heat, and some of the folks went up there. And it was not as bad as what everybody anticipated. It was actually pretty nice. So the decision, I can't force you to go. I can say, Frank, you need to go. You guys need to get out of this house. It's 40 degrees, and your body temperature, you're going to only stay warm for so long. And if you don't go, it's like we have a person that doesn't want to go to the hospital, that's injured or sick. I can't force you, but I can recommend, and that's what we did. We were recommending, and we took people out. The people that went out were in wheelchairs that needed to have the batteries charged and had other medical conditions that I was afraid that they wouldn't make it through the night because of the situation. And of course, as Mother Nature is as impromptu as it is, about 7:30, 8 o'clock Monday night, the lights started popping back on in town. I said, thank you, because if we would have gone another 2 days, we would have had some major issues. We had major issues to begin with, but it's a difficult situation. I'm stubborn, and I can get as stubborn as
anyone else and say, look, we really need to go, but I can't physically take you out of your home unless you're not able to respond. But it's it's a situation where we're not trying to cause a hardship. We're trying to make sure that you all get through the system, the situation, and make it through the night, because it was interesting, as interesting would go. And somebody, I guess Pennsylvania folklore says that if it snows in October, on whatever day it snows, that's how many snowstorms we're going to have this winter. It was the 29th, so there's a lot of snow coming, I think. I don't know about the woolly caterpillar, but I'm ready to go south. Yeah, it's the small ones. But as Kevin said, he's not the first line defense. If you need something, you call 911, and they will in turn get you to the right group. Kevin got involved Sunday night because we were concerned about the high rises with the population. We also have the Emmaus Village that has 70, 80 people. They had plans in place to start transporting people out. However, Northampton was out of power too. So it was a multiplying effect as we went along. The best thing you can do is stay in place if you can. But if you have family outside the area where there's power, go. We had a guy come back to the high-rise and was out with his son for dinner, and they brought him back. And I said, why did you come back? He goes, because he wouldn't go to the house with us. We had to bring him back here. There's a simple answer to that. Turn left instead of right and keep going back to your house. But, if we try to shelter in place for as long as we can. And then if we have to move, we start setting up procedures to get people out. We had buses, we had wheelchair vans, we had ambulances. We were moving people as we needed to with whatever facilities we had. But again, what Kevin said is with the county, they get involved, and now we start, we had warming centers set up, we had food, we brought food into the high rises. People go, well, where was the rest of us as far as why didn't we get food? We can't service 11,300 people on a daily basis, but if we get you to a shelter, we can. And fortunately, it stopped, the situation, the lights came on and things started to correct, so that was a good thing. But we were making rounds, checking, we went through the high rises, knocked on doors, through the hallways, everything, to make sure that everybody was okay. Yes, sir?
We live out in Lake Estate, so I don't know if you know where that is.
Oh, I most certainly do, sir.
All right. If we get snow out there, do they have capabilities of getting in there?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we have a lot of elderly people there.
Yep. It's a retirement community.
Right.
We, fire, EMS, and police and public works, we all work together as a team. When this was going on, a representative of each of our departments was involved in the situation so that we keep track of what's going on and help each other out. But if we can't get to you, you're out in Upper Milford Township, we'll call the road department and they'll plow to you so we can get in. We'll call for fire assistance because we have to carry somebody out in 3 foot of snow. So it's all a matter of, it's cooperative, it's cooperation between the departments that works.
Because we have a lot of elderly people in there.
Yeah. So, we also, on our subscription program with the ambulance, there's a place to list if you have a special need. That goes into a database and it gets printed out, and that's where we start to call and check. If you have the rotary dial phone or the push button that's on the wall, it will ring. If you have a wireless, hands-free, it won't. We were picking the phone up and go, hello, who's calling? Because it didn't ring for us. Cell phones are great, but you gotta have it.
We did that in our business.
You
We kept picking the phone up.
Say, hey,
every
anybody there?
30 seconds,
Yeah.
the secretary picking up and say, hello.
So, from our standpoint, it's a group effort on our part. And as Kevin mentioned, if it goes past what we can handle, that's when the county gets involved. And if it goes past that, that's when the state gets involved. And if it goes past that, that's when the feds get involved. But it was quite an interesting, 3 or 4 days as things go. But as far as evacuations, we have a siren that gets tested the first Saturday of each month at high noon. You hear the siren go off?
That's a good one.
That's, yeah, it's like a slide flute. And that is that's an alert system. So if you hear that in the middle of the day, and it's not a Saturday, the first Saturday at noon, tune your radios into one of the local stations. But you got to have batteries for a portable radio. How many people have a portable radio? We used to call them transistor radios. Now they call them cell phones or iPods or whatever.
Yellow blasters.
Yeah. They have those radios you can crank for emergency purposes. Yeah. I think probably during the storm you probably could have got 2,495 If you had a generator, you were gold. Yes, sir.
A lot of people in begin their system, you go on the internet, you like the three together. So when you got that, when the fire goes out, you're down there too.
Yeah, it's nice to have what they call bundles, but when the power goes out, the bundle goes down, and then there's nothing. We have cell phones, Verizon, and we had service. AT&T and some of the other carriers were down, but I took 143 calls on my cell phone in like 3 days from different sources and individuals. So it was busy.
I was buying AM,
FM
on the radios, and all the guys using them.
I saw some guy in his backyard with a campfire, and a blanket. He was sending smoke signals. Send help. Send help.
No weather, no nothing. Except Philly and Jersey.
Yeah. It was
Just music.
music to soothe. Yeah,
A lot of those radio stations now, they're all played by a computer.
Yeah.
Right.
In Massachusetts or whatever state, and there's nobody sitting at a desk anymore, so that's one of the factors that plays into it.
Was it Tuesday or Wednesday at 2 o'clock? Wednesday. Anybody hear the tones go off on the TVs Wednesday at 2 o'clock?
Nope.
National Alert Testing System.
Radios,
TVs, everything. That's where, you see it flash across. Well, of course, you don't have power to watch TV. So, if you hear that beep, 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 this is a test of the emergency broadcast system, that's what it's all about. And that's where your information is going to come from in the case of a situation that's continuing. We were lucky. We had 3-4 days. How about people that in Louisiana during the hurricanes went through, it was spillouts.
That's right.
So we were fortunate. One of the things that we found is people need to cooperate with each other and help each other out. And that's the name of the game. We had people that were calling and going out, picking people up, and taking food to them. As Kevin mentioned, there was, Turkey Hill had power because they had a generator. But that one, that took them 2 days to get that up before they had it. I remember growing up on evaporated milk. Dry milk, mix it with water. My mom used to mix it with a half gallon of milk to make a gallon. And then we'd mix that half gallon with another half gallon, and then we'd have even thinner milk.
Lots of pretzels.
Pretzels, cereal, whatever. Be prepared. Have stuff that does not need... Oh, the other thing, refrigerators. How many of you check your refrigerator on an hourly basis to see if the food was thawing?
Yeah, that's a dumb thing.
Open the door, yep, it's still cold in there. Every time you open it, it gets warmer and warmer. Hey, if it gets really cold outside, what do? Put it outside. Sometimes common sense is what saves us. And sometimes we get a little anxious.
All that.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
As a resident of Ridge Manor, I want to thank you because you did a fantastic job. I was one of the stubborn ones who didn't want to leave, but I left. I'm glad I did. We actually had a ball out at where we were. We were at one of the schools. We had a fantastic time. There were a lot of funny stories that came out of it. You guys all did a really, really good job.
Well, thank you.
He coerced a 101-year-old.
Yeah, I got a 101-year-old man out of his room. That was.
And he was dancing with me out there. He said he would, and he did.
Yes,
They
sir.
had a place up
The
the
shelter
side
that we
of
were
the
in
church.
Right.
had
And the free
four
sleeping
little
bag, you
babies,
could sleep there.
like,
Yeah.
well, 100-year-old man, that would be.
One of the problems that we have when the power goes out, if you have, like the high rises and some of, they're all individual heat pumps on the rooms. So each room has its own heater. And one of the things that we're looking for in town here is someplace where we can partner up, that we can at least get a generator that has like gas heat or oil heat, because it doesn't take as much power to turn those on a generator system. So we have something, to send people to. If the power's on, we don't have a problem. We have 5, 6, locations. But when the power went out, we were all kind of in the same sinking boat. So. Sorry.
No, thank you. And I know it's quite a long time, but two of the things that I'll look into, all right, one, I'll get you the information so that you can be more prepared at home, all right? The next thing I'll look into, which was a good point, and again, I didn't listen to the only radios we listened to were the fire, EMS radios, police radios, but it doesn't do much good to have a battery-operated radio, the crank kind, whatever it is, or if we have some type of other emergency, and you are listening to TV, you're listening to the radio, and no one's giving any information. All right, so that's a step, let's just say, that's outside the borough. So I will look into contacting the radio stations and saying, okay, which radio stations are all electronic and run by computer, which ones will actually have a live person that, and if I can find out who that would be, that we can get in touch with so that the residents would then say, okay, I've got to go to, I'm just thinking KYW out of Philly because I know the letters, okay? But if it's one of the local stations that we can say, listen, if you live in Emmaus, we have an important message to get out to you, all right? And you're going to be listening to a radio. You need to go to this radio station for information. Because, again, the reason that I'd like to look into that is because if you can stay home and get the information without saying, well, I've got to walk, I can't get the car out of the garage or whatever it is, then you got to venture out, which then creates could potentially risk your life as well as those coming to help you, whatever it may be. But at least that way we can get information to you via those radios we're telling everybody to have. All right? So, any other questions or suggestions? Yes, sir.
Both of you fellows have been saying that if they have a problem, call 911. But if we don't have any power, how do we call 911?
That's not necessarily true, because when Mike's talking about Verizon and AT&T, I was one of the people at AT&T, and you couldn't use it. I couldn't use it here in Emmaus, I couldn't use it in Coopersburg, because apparently the cell towers were,
RCN was down for 10 to 12 hours also.
What's that?
RCN was also down.
Okay, well, exactly. And that might be, again, if you have, they have all these family share plans. All right, my family has AT&T. Okay, didn't work. Everybody's calling, leaving that. Where are you? Where are you? I'm fine. The phone's just not ringing. Because I'm walking around with a perfectly good charged phone, but there's no signal reaching my phone. So I thought, okay, because of being on the fire department, I have a Verizon phone. No one has that number. Well, after this incident, it's like, okay, here's an alternative number to reach me at. If your neighbor, your buddy, whatever it is, you have AT&T, they've got Verizon or Nextel, share the numbers. You tell your niece or your, somebody, a relative, listen, if you can't reach me, this is what people have experienced. In fact, the emergency people experienced it. Here's someone who has Verizon. Here's somebody that has, some other carrier that maybe theirs is working when yours is not, or vice versa. And again, that's that team. We have to take care of each other. In times of these disasters.
Well, let's say there was no power.
Right.
And this facility had power, and you're going to use it as, I'm going to call it as a roaming line.
Right.
Couldn't the police or the fire department with their loudspeakers on their vehicles go around town and let people know? Because we can't hear from anybody else. TV's down, cell phones are down.
Correct.
Can you do something like that?
No, I think they've done that in the past, haven't they?
Occasionally, yeah, when we switched over to the 911, the county 911 system, they had a problem, and we had no 911 service for about 4 hours. We were out patrolling, and when I say patrolling, we were out in the community. And unfortunately, this last incident, it took every resource we had to keep things moving. You know, but that is an alternative.
Right.
You know, and I don't know if the phones, if there's no, if it's a Verizon a hard line to the house, if you pick that up and dial 911, if it wouldn't go through or not.
Might work.
Yeah, the phones work, it just they didn't ring.
No, might work.
But as Kevin said, there's pull boxes around town. There's not a lot of them, but there's some that you just pull the box, and it sets, will set the wheels in motion.
Yes, sir.
What about CD radios?
As long as you have power.
Like so,
Turn my car.
Right. There were people that were charging their cell phones because they got the car charger.
Right.
All right, that is an alternative.
That's how it is.
one thing I was concerned about that, when the power went out was, how do I find out if the power went out at the water treatment plant? Because if it did, then it would be dangerous to drink the water, and it's hard to find out.
They have generators. They have backup generators. Yes.
Yeah, the wells in town here have generators on them, or provide. That's another good point. If you live on a well, if you have a well on your property and the power goes out, you have no water. How do you flush your toilets? Buckets. The bucket brigade. Yeah. Fill the bathtub up. If you know there's bad weather coming and they're talking about if your lights flicker once, they're going to flicker twice probably. Turn on the faucet and run some water.
And don't dump it into the tank. Dump it right
into the bowl. Yeah.
Go find the water body.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that happen.
Yes, Chris.
For those of you who have lifelines, most of the lifelines have backup batteries. And I found this out because mine worked, and I have Verizon telephone. A lot of people who have the RCN or something like it did not have the lifeline working, but they were all supposed to have battery backup, at least for a couple of hours.
And you know what? And again, everything, like all these systems, a lot of it, they have battery backup, battery this, battery that. Again, if you have a system like that, you may want to inquire, like, when was the last time it was serviced? I mean, I can't tell you during the hurricane, and I think the power may have been out 24 hours for some people, maybe a little bit longer. But we go in the basement, and they're like, well, I have a battery backup, but that didn't work. Well, when did you last maintain it? Well, we got it 5 years ago. I mean, they didn't look at it for 5 years. You can't expect it to work if you're not going to check on it. And, these services, again, I do the inspection, so I run across batteries that haven't been changed in years in some of these alarm systems. But it's one of those things that if you have a system like that, call the company now and say, okay, is my system, if I lose power for X number of hours, what can I expect? And if they say, ma'am, we haven't serviced your unit in a while, maybe somebody needs to come out to make sure that the batteries, that the system's actually operating properly. Okay? But again, that's stuff that you have to take care of on your own. Because we don't, as emergency services personnel now, Mike's crew may know a little bit better. I'm more on the fire end. We're not aware of people having backup, sump pumps and stuff like that. Usually we find out when there's a disaster, and then it's a little bit late.
I don't know whether it's something emergency management is involved with. I used to live in Gross Towers, and on every floor they had 2 or 3 outlets in the halls marked in red. strictly on backup for hospitals. Is there a way that emergency managers or the fire can get through to all the other high-rises in the areas? Rick Manor does not have anything like that.
They're working on putting some power in.
Yeah.
That's more than what they had down in the multi-purpose room. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 9:30.
I was just gonna say,
So